June 3, 2024. The Rayburn House Office Building on Capitol Hill. Dr. Anthony Fauci raised his right hand and swore an oath before the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic. After more than 2 years in retirement, the nation's most recognizable public health figure had returned to answer questions about the policies that reshaped American life. The hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the walls. This was not Fauci's first appearance before Congress, but it carried different weight. The pandemic had receded. The emergency declarations had ended. Enough time had passed for retrospective examination. Chairman Brad Wenstrup opened with a direct statement. Americans had been told to follow the science. They had reorganized their lives around specific rules presented as medically necessary. Now, those assurances were being examined under oath. The 6-foot social distancing rule had become one of the most recognizable features of pandemic life. Stickers on grocery store floors, tape marks in pharmacy lines, plexiglass barriers at restaurants, school desks spaced apart, churches with roped-off pews, businesses that couldn't maintain the distance shut their doors. The rule was simple, specific, and universally enforced. But where did it come from? In January 2024, during 14 hours of closed-door testimony, congressional staff asked Fauci about the origins of the 6-foot standard. The transcript, released months before his public appearance, contained an exchange that would draw national attention. Committee Staff Director Mitch Benzine asked when discussions about the 6-foot threshold began. Fauci's response was straightforward. He did not recall. The distance, he said, sort of just appeared. He could not remember a discussion about whether it should be 5 feet or 6 feet. It was simply 6 feet. Benzine asked a follow-up. Had Fauci seen studies supporting the 6-foot standard? Fauci's answer was equally direct. He was not aware of studies supporting that specific distance. Such a study would be very difficult to conduct. He characterized the decision as empiric, a medical term meaning a determination based on experience, rather than controlled clinical trials. The transcript made clear what Fauci was saying and what he was not. He was not claiming the rule had no scientific basis whatsoever. He was distinguishing between formal clinical trials and practical judgment made under urgent circumstances. But the distinction mattered less than the admission itself. The rule that restructured American society had not emerged from rigorous experimental evidence. To understand why this matters, revisit how the 6-foot rule functioned. It was not presented as a rough guideline. It became encoded in federal recommendations, state mandates, and local ordinances. The CDC issued formal guidance. Schools adopted it as policy. Businesses faced closure if they could not comply. The rule carried institutional authority. The enforcement was not abstract. Restaurants that could not space tables 6 feet apart lost the ability to serve customers indoors. Schools that could not achieve 6-foot spacing kept students in remote learning. Churches limited attendance. Small businesses calculated whether their square footage could accommodate the required distance. When it could not, they closed. Children learned through screens. Elderly residents went months without visitors. Funerals were limited to 10 people. Weddings were postponed. The 6-foot rule was not one policy among many. It was the spatial logic that governed nearly every aspect of public life. Throughout this period, the rule was defended as science-based. Federal health officials emphasized that Americans should trust the guidance. The phrase, "follow the science," became common. Public health messaging treated the 6-foot distance as settled, derived from rigorous analysis. Questioning the rule was often characterized as anti-science or dangerous. But now, under oath, one of the most prominent defenders of that guidance acknowledged he was not aware of studies supporting the specific threshold. The rule had appeared. It was empiric. It was difficult to study. When Fauci appeared for his public hearing on June 3rd, he addressed the issue directly. Republican lawmakers pressed him on the disconnect between the certainty with which it had been communicated and the uncertainty he now described. Fauci clarified his earlier testimony. The 6-foot guideline had come from the CDC. It was not his decision. The CDC held responsibility for recommendations for schools and public spaces. He elaborated on what he meant when he said there was no science behind it. He was referring to the absence of controlled clinical trials. There were no randomized studies comparing different distances. That research would be difficult to conduct during a rapidly evolving pandemic. The CDC had based its recommendation on older research about respiratory droplets, studies from decades earlier suggesting larger droplets fell within a certain distance. Fauci also testified that the assumption underlying the rule turned out to be incomplete. Officials had believed COVID-19 spread primarily through larger respiratory droplets that fell to the ground within a few feet. That view was incorrect. Aerosols, smaller particles that remained suspended in the air and could travel farther, also played a significant role. The 6-foot rule, designed for droplet-based transmission, was insufficient for aerosol spread. This acknowledgement carried implications. If the rule was based on an incomplete understanding of transmission, and if there were no clinical trials demonstrating the effectiveness of 6 feet specifically, then the rule was less a product of rigorous science and more a product of institutional judgment under uncertainty. Fauci made clear he did not personally set the 6-foot standard. The CDC made those determinations. But he had been the public face of the federal pandemic response. His name, his voice, his assurances had been central to communicating the guidance. When questioned about whether he felt obligated to push back on CDC guidance lacking strong evidentiary support, Fauci responded that he had challenged the CDC multiple times on various issues, but it was not appropriate to publicly challenge a sister organization. This answer revealed a tension. Federal health agencies have different roles and authority, but to the public, they spoke with a unified voice. When that voice communicated certainty, Americans reasonably assumed it reflected institutional consensus grounded in solid evidence. The internal disagreements, the limitations of the data, the practical judgments made in the absence of definitive studies, these remained invisible. The hearing grew contentious at points. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene accused Fauci of crimes against humanity, prompting objections and brief disruption. But beyond the theatrical moments, the substance remained. The 6-foot rule had been presented as science. Under oath, Fauci testified it was empiric. Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., who had spent years criticizing pandemic-era policies, did not testify at the hearing. But his critiques, expressed through Children's Health Defense and in his book The Real Anthony Fauci, had centered on the very issues the hearing exposed. Kennedy had argued throughout the pandemic that institutional authority was being used to enforce policies without sufficient transparency about underlying evidence. He had opposed vaccine mandates, lockdown measures, and school closures, characterizing them as overreach unsupported by rigorous science. Kennedy's criticisms had been dismissed by many public health officials as dangerous misinformation. His organization had filed lawsuits challenging vaccine requirements. Those lawsuits largely failed. But his broader argument that follow the science had become institutional authority rather than empirical evidence found validation in Fauci's testimony. Kennedy had drawn a distinction between institutional science and actual science. Institutional science, in his framing, was the pronouncements of federal agencies, backed by authority and prestige. Actual science was transparent, subject to debate, built on replicable studies. The 6-foot rule, as Fauci described it, appeared to fall into the former category. It had the imprimatur of the CDC. It was communicated with confidence, but it lacked the underlying controlled studies that would characterize rigorous experimental science. During the pandemic, dissenting voices faced significant consequences. Scientists who questioned lockdown policies found their research dismissed or reputations attacked. Doctors who raised concerns about school closures were accused of prioritizing economics over lives. Parents who objected to masking mandates for young children were labeled selfish. Social media platforms removed content contradicting federal health guidance, often citing CDC recommendations as the standard for acceptable information. The assumption behind this enforcement was that the guidance reflected settled science. If the CDC said 6 feet, then 6 feet was scientifically validated. Challenging it was not scientific debate, it was spreading misinformation. But if the guidance was empiric, a practical judgment made without controlled trials, then the line between legitimate scientific disagreement and dangerous misinformation became harder to draw. Fauci testified that the 6-foot rule contributed to keeping schools closed longer than necessary. Many schools could not achieve the required spacing. Classrooms were too small. The choice became remote learning or non-compliance. Most chose remote learning. The educational consequences are still being measured. Learning loss was significant, particularly for younger children and disadvantaged students. If the 6-foot rule had been based on definitive evidence, those trade-offs might have been justified. But if the rule was empiric, if it sort of just appeared, if it was not backed by controlled trials, then the costs imposed by rigid adherence take on a different character. Representative Jim Jordan pressed Fauci on this point. The 6-foot rule had crippled businesses and kept students out of school. Americans had suffered. That suffering continued because trust in public health institutions had been damaged. When people learned that rules presented as science-based were actually empiric judgments, their willingness to trust future guidance diminished. Fauci's response was measured. He did not dispute that mistakes had been made. He acknowledged that communication could have been more precise. The term empiric should perhaps have been explained more clearly. The limitations of evidence should have been more transparent. But he emphasized the extraordinary circumstances. Decisions had to be made quickly. Perfect information was not available. This defense is not unreasonable. Pandemics do not wait for controlled trials. But the issue was not whether decisions had to be made quickly. The issue was how those decisions were communicated. If the 6-foot rule was an empiric judgment, a reasonable precaution in the absence of definitive data, it could have been presented that way. Instead, it was presented as science-based guidance that reasonable people should not question. The difference is significant. When citizens are told to follow empiric guidance, educated guesses made under uncertainty, they can weigh that against their own circumstances. When they are told to follow the science, they are being told that questioning the guidance is rejecting science itself. The first framing invites informed consent. The second demands compliance. Throughout his testimony, Fauci emphasized that he was not solely responsible for pandemic policy. The CDC made certain decisions. The White House made others. State and local officials implemented their own measures. This diffusion of responsibility is accurate. The federal pandemic response involved multiple agencies and levels of government. But this diffusion also created a problem of accountability. When policies proved misguided or when evidence supporting them turned out weaker than claimed, responsibility became impossible to locate. The CDC pointed to NIH research. NIH deferred to CDC guidelines. The White House cited both agencies. State officials followed federal guidance. Everyone was following someone else's recommendations, and those recommendations were based on evidence that, in retrospect, was less solid than the public had been led to believe. What Fauci's testimony revealed was not malice or conspiracy. It revealed something more mundane, and perhaps more troubling. It revealed a system in which uncertain judgments were communicated as settled science, in which empiric decisions were presented as evidence-based policy, and in which institutional authority filled the gaps left by incomplete data. This matters for future pandemics. If the lesson is that officials made the best decisions they could under difficult circumstances, then the next response will likely follow similar patterns. Uncertain judgments will be presented with confidence. Dissenting views will be marginalized. Compliance will be enforced through institutional pressure. But if the lesson is that transparency about uncertainty is essential to maintaining public trust, then the next response might look different. Officials might acknowledge more openly when guidance is empiric rather than evidence-based. They might explain reasoning behind precautionary measures without overstating supporting data. They might create space for legitimate scientific debate without labeling dissenters as spreaders of misinformation. The hearing did not resolve these questions. It documented them. It created a permanent record of what was known, what was not known, and how that gap was communicated. Fauci testified under oath. His words are part of the official congressional record. The 6-foot rule sort of just appeared. It was empiric. It was difficult to study. It came from the CDC, not from Fauci personally. These facts are now established. What is clear is that institutional authority by itself is not the same as scientific evidence. Federal agencies can issue guidance that is reasonable and well-intentioned without that guidance being the product of rigorous, controlled studies. The public can reasonably expect more transparency about that distinction. Critics like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who spent years arguing that pandemic policies reflected institutional power more than scientific certainty, now have sworn testimony supporting their central claim. The 6-foot rule was not based on definitive studies. It was a judgment call. Whether that judgment was correct is debatable. That it was presented as something more certain than it actually was is now a matter of record. The hearing room emptied. The cameras were packed away. Dr. Fauci returned to his retirement, but the questions raised by his testimony remain. How should public health guidance be communicated? What level of evidence is required before policies are enforced? How can institutional authority be reconciled with scientific uncertainty? The 6-foot rule is history now. Most Americans no longer think about maintaining distance. The stickers have been removed. The plexiglass barriers have come down. But the implications of how that rule was created and communicated will shape public health policy for years to come. The record is clear. The rule sort of just appeared. It was empiric. It was difficult to study. Americans deserve transparency about the limits of public health knowledge and the judgments that fill those gaps. The next pandemic will inevitably require difficult decisions under uncertainty. Those decisions will be better made and better received if they come with honesty about what is known and what is not. Dr. Fauci's testimony provided that honesty, even if it came later than many would have preferred. The 6-foot rule was not based on rigorous clinical trials. It was a reasonable precaution made under emergency circumstances. It was communicated with more certainty than the underlying evidence justified, and it reshaped American society in ways that are still being measured. That is the documentary record. That is what the testimony revealed. How that record should inform future policy is a question for democratic deliberation, not institutional decree.